everybody's favorite topic of conversations, hard conversations. To set the stage, let's have a definition. I'm going to rely on a book and an author. The book is called Crucial Conversations. As you can imagine, there's lots of different books, so this is just one of them. And in it, the author, Carrie Patterson, describes hard conversations as one that have three common characteristics. The first is that there are high stakes. The second is that there are strong emotions. And the third, which I think is a critical aspect of the definition, is opposing opinions. And when you put those three together, if you're me, you get nervous. And so we're going to hear a little bit from these two amazing leaders about how hard conversations have shaped their careers, tactics that they have for having these hard conversations, and hopefully a couple of stories about ones that went well, in addition to maybe some that had areas for improvement. So with a little bit of an introduction, first let's go with Margot. Margot is the president and CEO of Ancestry, whose products and services leverage data and distinct content across family history, consumer genomics, in order to provide customers and consumers with insights into who they are, where they come from, and help inspire their future. Prior to joining Thank you. I love the fans. OK, prior to joining Ancestry, Margot was CEO of Mattel, president of the Americas at Google, Google's VP of Global Sales Operations. She's also held leadership roles as COO of Groupon, CMO of Discover Financial Services, and was a partner at McKinsey. She currently is on the board of McDonald's and Ad Council. Kick-ass woman number one. To her left is Sukhinder, president of Stubhub, the world's largest ticket marketplace with tickets available for over 10 million live sports events, musics, and theater events in more than 40 countries. She has over 20 years of leadership experience scaling and founding companies including Google, Amazon, Yodel, Joyous, Polyvore, and The Boardless. She also serves as a public board director of Urban Outfitters and was previously a board member of Ericsson, TripAdvisor, J.Crew, Stitch Fix, as well as an advisor to Twitter. I have had the privilege of asking these women how to have hard conversations in my own job, and I'm really excited about the new opportunities that they are currently in. They both recently started these roles around 4 months ago, and I can imagine those first 100 days, there were some interesting conversations that you guys had. So let's start with Margot, who literally just had her board of directors meeting yesterday. And maybe you can tell us a little bit about if there was any hard conversations in that forum.
So, well, as my team, thank you, team. Awesome to have. We have a lot of great women at Ancestry, so that was a wonderful surprise when I got there. So thank you for being amazing colleagues. So it's an amazing company. It's been around for 30 years, and it's been a huge innovator. And I got to the organization, and we have just this enormous amount of growth opportunities. And so as you can imagine, you go into the board meeting, and I set up this all-day strategic session, which we had yesterday for the board, because I wanted to bring them all together. And when I first joined the company, you interview with all the board members and your investors, and you get a sense of what they really want for the company. And everyone doesn't always agree. So we went through a huge process as a leadership team and took in all that feedback and really thought about where we were going. And I knew up front from those initial conversations that some of the areas that we wanted to strike out into and do differently, not all those board members agreed with. So I had to really think about how am I going to put the right facts in front of them, how am I going to have the right pre-meetings ahead of time to tease out once they've had a chance to see the facts, and then orchestrate that conversation in the room. And of course, like all of us, sounds really easy, but you're always a little bit nervous before. And I think that's so much of it, for me, which is, how do you independently, with your team, come up with a great point of view, but then be really thoughtful about all the different viewpoints that you're going to have to engage with, and then think about how you give people the time and space to interact so that you go from it, yes, it's a hard conversation, but it ends up being a true conversation. Because you're not trying to push your view, you're trying to get everyone to collaborate in a shared space. And for me, I think that's one of the most important things when you know you want to push the envelope. How do you put the facts in front of people? And how do you orchestrate the whole group to yes? So I haven't even had a chance to update my team, but team, we got everything we wanted from the board meeting yesterday.
Sukhinder, how about your first 100 days?
Well, of course, I think there are lots of conversations that happen that are pretty critical in those first 100 days. But I think when I arrived at Stubhub, I was on tap within, I think, day 10 to have a conversation with our entire extended leadership team, because they come in twice a year, our directors and above, and we're expecting, I think, to both be able to hear from me a vision, and to be within the first 10 days on the job, and also kind of to share kind of their perspectives. And so I felt a lot of pressure in that first 10 days to have a point of view. Like, everybody wanted me to have a point of view on what the company should do. And interestingly, by the way, if anybody knows me, I never don't have a point of view. Like, ever. So asking me to have a point of view is like, you know, asking me to, like, I don't know, hug my kids. It's like, it can't not do it. So my initial temptation actually was to share all of my observations. But when I got to that room and I had 100 different directors, and by the way, they all had stuff to tell me, one of the most seminal things for me was to turn that situation around and to avoid feeling like I had to bring up all the difficult topics. I know that sounds like counterintuitive, but really, to first, you know, ask the questions that would precipitate them having the hard conversations. And we had, interestingly, I would say an incredibly intimate kind of half-day session with 100 people that I didn't know, where I really feel like the room opened up to have a very hard conversation that I never expected to have about things that were going on in the business and people's frustrations. And at the end of it, they all looked at me. And I think they were expecting me to, like, write down a list and come up with a game plan. And I remember that at the end of that session, I just said, okay, I got it. And I later learned that the most seminal thing that had happened in that time was me not coming back with the answer on the hard conversation, but just saying, I got it. I got it. I'm going to think about it. I'm going to come back to you. And so that was, I think, an example of a very hard set of conversations in the first 10 days on the job, where my initial inclination is like, come in, share my point of view, like, let's go. And instead, opening up the conversation for other people to have the hard conversation with each other, where I was the bystander, and then resisting the need to come in with the solution right then, turned out to be the unlock in that situation. And I felt like it was something that was actually pretty hard, because it surfaced a lot of things and stuff. And we're like, oh, my first 10 days on the job, whoa, that's like more than I was expecting in terms of intimacy. But the authenticity of that conversation, I would just say opening up the space kind of led to, I think, high trust very quickly. And I had to sort of resist some of my natural inclinations, which is to come in and problem solve right away. So that's an example of a hard conversation.
Let's double click there for a second. So that ability to press pause is actually rather difficult, right? You're sitting in this forum, you have lots of opposing opinions, the emotions are high, the stakes are potentially high, you're trying to figure out what the strategic vision is. How are you, or what tips would you have to share about how to realize where you are in that conversation and potentially the need to step back a little bit? You know, is there tactics or tips that you have about recognizing when it could be beneficial to take a step back?
Well, I'm sure Margot has thoughts on this as well. I mean, I think that, first of all, so if you just turn that question around, the reverse of having hard conversations that you have to lead is leading other people into a hard conversation. So as I've gotten older in my career, I've really learned that people always think the hard conversation is on you. And I've sort of gone from having these seminal moments where I'm like, this is the hard conversation. And by the way, there are still seminal moments where you have to have the hard conversation, to really being like asking people what they think is going on. And typically, the minute you ask people what they think is going on and give them the opportunity to speak, all the hard issues will surface pretty quickly. And then I think your job really becomes to become the synthesizer of that, make sure you've heard it correctly. And I think you end up parsing. Like, I mean, I'm sure everybody does that. You know, you parse like what's easily kind of digestible and solvable, and then where do you kind of look at the harder problems, and instead of saying I'm going to solve it now, you know, identify a time frame and a smaller set of people with which you're going to solve it. So that's typically how I handle that now. Again, there's still moments when I have seminally hard conversations, but more often than not now it's like, before I reveal what I think, I'm like, what do you guys think is going on?
Margo, you mentioned kind of creating that shared space. Like, how do you create those shared spaces in the organizations you lead in a similar way of being able to make sure that the conversation can actually happen?
Yeah, I think that, since Sukhinder was talking, I was thinking about two things that are really important to me as a leader that she talked about, I think for all of us, is I find that if you go and talk to a roundtable of your people, especially if you skip down a couple of levels, it's so grounding, because often you sit with your senior leadership team, you think you know what's going on, and then you go down and you really talk to the folks that are trying to get stuff done, and you find out where the truth disconnects. And I think as a leader, especially if you're trying to drive transformational change, you have to constantly check back in a very open and honest way. And I find that organizations, as Sukhinder said, are so open to sharing as a leader the honest feedback that you need to hear about what's working and where we can improve. And I think, as you said, you don't need to give people the answers. They actually usually know it. And a lot of it's just how carefully you're listening. And then I think as you think about making space in one of those more uncomfortable situations, for me, it's, I think, showing genuine empathy for the person that's there. And I think as a leader, the most important thing is when you come to a room, are you willing to suspend your agenda and really listen? And I think to do that, sometimes when you have a really busy day, sometimes I just have to take a 5-minute break and go to the restroom or walk around the building or something to make sure if I'm going into a meeting that I know it's going to be stressful, that I'm 100% present. And then constantly reminding myself during the conversation, am I listening? Am I absolutely listening? And I think paraphrasing, asking that follow-up question, making sure you dig underneath the surface once or twice really builds that trust Sukhinder was talking about in terms of people feeling that you're authentically walking in their shoes. Like you genuinely would like to know. And often what I do is I ask for an example. Like what could we do that would make that better for you? And can you give me an example? And typically it's in the pattern recognition by the 4th or 5th roundtable that you really start to understand what is the root cause of some of these issues, so that as a leader, you can not necessarily don't need to make the decisions, but you need to fix the root causes. And I think for any organization, that's incredibly important.
One of the things that I've heard is that you have a hard conversation where you surface these issues. And clearly you want to make sure that the people you're having the conversation with really believe that you're listening. Then they wonder what happens after you raise that hard conversation. So there's all this nervousness, you get it out, you're able to kind of really understand the core issue. Now you have to solve the hard conversation topic. So how do you move from identification through the various steps to actually get to resolution?
Well, and I'll start, and frankly, I learned a lot. Sukhinder was one of the early leaders at Google, and I can shoot, too modest to say this, but she was always known as someone who was willing to talk about the tough stuff and really cared about her organization and making a difference. And what I learned going to Google, because everything we did had never been done before, and so the sense of being, as a leader, truly being authentic, and it's okay to say you don't know. And before that, I'd worked in financial services, and it was all about being buttoned up and perfect and having, all, looking really, the perfect PowerPoint and everything else. And I got to Google, and I realized the best leaders were the best storytellers, and they were the people that were willing to say, look, this is what I know, but this is what I'm not sure about, and feeling okay with that. And that's what made people trust them. And for me, I think that sense of follow-up and honesty, when I first started at the company, similar to Sukhinder's experience, I got a lot of really helpful feedback, and my team who's there who clapped, thank you again. But they know that when I came in, I heard a lot of stuff that I was like, wow, we need to do something about that. And if I just heard it, and we didn't actually stand up as a leadership team in a town hall and say, this is actually what I heard, these are the issues, and we connected it back to our employee survey on ESAT, and we said, these are the things that we're going to do to make this better, but we don't have all the answers, and this is the way we want to make a path forward. And every month in the town hall, we're coming back to, here's the next improvement we're making, here's the way forward. And I think it's extremely important that you actually follow up and you're accountable, because I don't think an organization believes that change is happening if they don't actually see tangible proof. Otherwise, they can easily feel like it's kind of going into the vortex.
Sukhinder, a slightly different question over to you. one of the typical responses that women have when facing hard conversations is to avoid them. We were talking a lot about how you surface these conversations, but you still need somebody who has that challenge to actually raise the conversation. So can you tell us a little bit about, have you ever avoided a conversation, or would you tell us all not to avoid such hard conversation?
Well, first of all, just as a side note on women, I feel like women are much more willing to have the hard conversations than the guys. So I'm surprised that that's research, because in my experience, women really want to get to the heart of an issue, at least if my survey of like several of my friends and mine are right. But so actually, despite what the research says, I think that I would characterize it a little differently. I think that I always find that my women leaders want to get to the heart of an issue, but I think the fear with women just generally is emotion, right? And I'm one of those people, by the way. I mean, anybody who thinks that it's easy, while I'm comfortable having hard conversations, I can tell you many times, including at Google, where I surfaced a hard conversation and my eyes teared up. I mean, I can't tell you how many times Omid Kordestani had to listen to me both surface a hard topic and like tear up while I was doing it. So I think the fear for women is not that they're not willing to identify the issue and go at it. It's just that we know sometimes that when we do, you know, sometimes emotion is what other people fear hearing from us, and sometimes for, you know, I know lots of women, I know about you, I know lots of women who cry when they're empathetic, and I know lots of women, myself included, who cry when they're mad. I mean, like, so I think that there is something to, it's not less about the willingness, it's just sometimes the emotional piece as well. So when I think about having those hard conversations, and even in my own career, I think a couple things. Interestingly, I felt like one of the ways for me to tackle having hard conversations when I knew I would get emotional is, yes, prepare it all, but actually just like demystify it for people and go right through it. Like my teams will tell you, I've teared up in front of them, I'm like, okay guys, here it goes, I'm gonna cry. Like, just so you know, like, but I'm good with it, so you all need to be good with it. And I think to some degree when you have emotion, I think it's one thing to be emotional and not acknowledge it. I think it's another thing to be like, hey, you know, like, if I tear up, like, don't worry about it. I got it. Like, moving through that moment and not making it a bigger moment. And sometimes, you know, somebody like Omid would just sit there and he would be good with it. When I just, like, teared up, I'm like, I'll be okay in just a second. And I would get through it. And so I think part of having a hard conversation is if you're nervous, even demystifying that nervousness, or if you're a woman who gets emotional, or even a guy, but women, you know, certainly sometimes we get emotional in hard topics. It's about demystifying it for people, because it's not always purposeful. But I think to the extent that you handle it as not a non-issue, but like, hey, you know, I got it, it happens, move on. I'm still on topic. We still have to get through this hard conversation. I'd usually tear up for a moment, and then I'd be good. And you know what? Myself and the other person, we went on and we had the conversation. And so for me, that was always the challenge for me in hard conversations. Sometimes it still is. Like, I get so, you know, passionate or emotional. And so I've just gotten to the point in my career where I just own it. I'm like, and everybody else is, you know, and I try and make it sort of a lighter thing, right? It's because I'm like, okay, it's going to happen. I'm like, I'll say to my team, I'm like, say something hard to me, I'm going to tear up. Say something nice to me, I'm going to tear up. Like, either way, just like, the best thing is to just not say anything nice to me, because you'll make me like super emotional at this moment, and you know. But in general, that was always my hard thing, was not bringing up the topic. It was knowing that I could get emotional about it and wanting to make the other person comfortable with me being emotional about it. Being like, it's okay. Like, I can tear up about something and still get right back on message and right on topic, and we're still going to go after the topic. So tears are what they are.
One of the things that, at least in my experience, that I've been both emotional about as well as believing that there's high stakes, so 2 out of 3, is a conversation about, or a negotiation about, promotion. I anticipate that lots of us have that fear of, how do I go in and ask for that promotion? How do I go in and ask for that salary increase? How do I go in and ask for that stretch opportunity or that new opportunity? How have you guys both initiated those conversations and then responded to them when people have come to you?
So, you know, my experience is that women in general ask for things probably 20% of the time compared to the guys. So the next time, I think the most important, if I send any message to the women in this room, the guys are knocking on my door telling me what they want all the time. So of course, as a woman leader, I'm really conscious of that, and so I try to overcorrect by going to the women and asking them, hey, what do you want to do at the next step? But I think it's something really important that we as women start to embrace, that you have to put yourself in the path of opportunity. A lot of people talk about successful people don't get lucky. They put themselves in the path of opportunity. Because senior people are busy. And so if you don't let people know what your interests are, where you stand, what you might do to improve if you want to get to this next level, and you don't do it outside of the, quote, transactional moment where you're getting a review, that's like the worst time to do it. The way better time is that little empty space after a meeting, and you're just hanging out with your manager, and maybe you just presented something, and you have that extra 15 minutes at the end of the day, and you say, hey, do you need to run somewhere? And if they say no, you just say, great, I'd love to get your advice on something. I really enjoyed that meeting, and I've always thought that it would be awesome, right, to be in this next space. And I'd love to get your advice if you think that, what can I do to be ready for that? And let them tell you in those moments, and then that will kind of register in their brain, because that's what, if you don't put yourself in that path, then when the next person says, oh, well, do you know anybody who might want to do that? Is that person going to be top of mind? Probably not, right? The person who told them 5 times is going to be top of mind. And so I think as women, we have to create that space to put ourselves in the path of opportunity. I think when it comes to negotiations, I encourage everyone. I try to actually get her to speak at this event. Really good friend of mine. She's a professor at the Kellogg School of Business. Her name is Victoria Medvec. Look her up on YouTube. She is the best negotiator. She's like one of the best negotiators in the entire world, and she's a badass. So like whenever I find myself in a really difficult situation, it's called like text Victoria, and I get a little session with you. But there are 3 tips that she'll always give that I think are so helpful. They're so basic, but so when you want to negotiate with someone, you always want to make the first move. You don't wait for them to come to you. You want to frame what the space is, right, for negotiation. The second thing is when you frame the space, you always want to put things in a framework of what's good for both sides. So it's not just I want this, but it's in the framework of what I'd really like to do is make this great contribution, and to do that, doing this and this would really advance me forward. But as you put that set of things forward, make sure there's some things that you can take off the table that are high value to them but may not be high value to you, so that you look like you're compromising, right? So a great negotiating strategy, so you end up where you want to be. So you got to know where you want to end up, frame the conversation, put some things into that you are willing to take off the table, so you always can get back where you want to. And it's one of the simplest things, but I think so often women, we're kind of nervous to go ask for things, and we kind of hold back, and I'm just going to ask them for that one thing, because if I only ask them for that one thing, but it's actually a lot easier to go in and say, there's like 3 or 4 different opportunities I've been thinking about. This, or this. Which of those do you think I'm the most qualified for? Then you start to have a conversation. The person doesn't have to feel like they say yes or no. You start to, and then this is the one I think I'm the most qualified for. And they often end up there with you. But if you don't give them some choice or you don't frame the conversation, you're going to learn a lot less.
Sukhinder, how about you?
So negotiation for me is the opposite of what I talked about before, because my difficult conversations are always the really deeply personal ones, and usually ones about myself, actually, like not about, but remember, like I grew up in biz dev, so like I enjoy negotiation conversations. I'm like, I never cry in negotiation conversations. I'm too busy having fun, which is true, sadly. But I think my advice, because I know that if you didn't grow up in sales or business development, that maybe it is like a very nerve-wracking thing. My advice is very simple. I never ever begin a negotiation that is piecemeal ever, and I hate it when people do. When I'm preparing for any negotiation, I have all the data. I want a list of like every possible parameter. To Margot's point, I know exactly where I need to end up. And I only negotiate as a package. I never negotiate one-offs. I only negotiate as a package, whether that's a business dealing, whether that's me personally. So I'm putting it all on the table as a package. I know exactly where I want to end up and what my minimum viable is. And again, in any situation, when somebody's coming to me to do a negotiation with a business partner, or when somebody negotiates with me, and they haven't framed the entire package and they make a one-off ask, they're going to, they may or may not get their one-off, but what they missed is the opportunity to just, and so I always encourage when you're thinking about negotiating, yes, have all the data, and to Margot's point, have the 10 parameters and be prepared to be on a sliding scale and know what matters, and always, always, always have something to give, which means you always start higher than where you need to end up, because there's no negotiation where one person is going to unilaterally give you everything you want, so.
One of the other comments, switching gears away from negotiations, which I'm sure we could have dedicated panels on for years to come. One of the core differences in understanding your audience is how many people are actually in the room. So can you tell me a little bit about how your tone, your approach, or how you prepare is different when it's a one-on-one type of a conversation versus when it's an all-hands conversation or different levels of people? So really understanding the context in which you're having hard conversations, how does that impact your approach to preparing for them?
I do believe as a leader you have to think about how you show up differently in different places, and mainly because people have different levels of context in dealing with you. So if I'm having a one-on-one with someone who reports to me, you already have, hopefully, a personal relationship with them. In my case, I believe business is personal, so you have to have unstructured time. So one of the best piece of advice I ever got from a mentor was make sure you're not too transactional with both the people you work with and the people that are your peers in other areas that you work often with. Make sure that you're having that lunch with them so you understand them as a person. Because when that tough moment happens, if you don't have that broader relationship, it's just a lot harder to give someone feedback because you don't have context on what they care about their person, and so I don't think you're as effective. You have to kind of really build up that relationship bank with people, and I think a lot of people, especially women, we're just trying to get home to the kids or the other things in our lives, and so we give up that. When I'm thinking about a broader audience, say my whole organization, they may not see me very often. In those cases, I really try to put myself in their shoes, and I'm extremely focused on, what are the one or two most important messages that I want them to take away? And it's about filtering it down to the simplest possible elements and being consistent. Because it's in those broader organizations when they don't see you often, and you guys probably do this as leaders, right? You're always like, is that consistent with what they told me last time? Is that consistent with that strategy that they've laid out? And I think that's a really hard thing to do as a leader, is to provide that, because it's in that consistency that the trust is built. When it comes to a board or elements like that, I think it's important to know what is the most important job that needs to be done in that setting. So if I'm a board member, my job is not to run the company. My job is to ask great questions and bring expertise. So I have to put myself out of my operating mindset and put myself into my job is to support the management team, to ask a great question or suggest an example or another company they might look at that sparks an insight, but I'm not going to be there, right? I'm going to show up once a quarter and with the occasional phone call in between, and I don't want to cross that line where I sound like I'm overreaching, because then they're just not going to listen. And so I do think it's really important to think about what's the context I'm in, who are these people, how well do they know me, what was the last interaction that you had? And it's a hard thing to do, to slow down and do that. But I think as you get more senior in your careers, it's not what you do anymore, it's how you do it. And that becomes very important, that you think about those different audiences and how you need to show up.
Sukhinder and Margot, then over back to you, but first with Sukhinder, can you tell us of a time in your career, like maybe 10 years ago, that you got this unbelievable critical insight from a hard conversation and like how it actually helped your career?
Sure. So one of the things about hard conversations, and I think you learn it as you go, and I certainly had a moment like this, I think it was at Google, it's just because you have a hard conversation, it doesn't mean it's all going to work out, right? Because we think the hard thing is having a hard conversation. You can have the hard conversation and still not get to full resolution, right? So I think probably one of the critical insights I had, I think it was at a conversation at Google, and I think Margot was there in maybe the kindler, gentler days. When when I was at Google, I loved my time at Google, but there was certainly turf wars and, great people, but some jockeying in the background. And I remember a point in time where there was jockeying that was going on that I was not happy with, right? And And so I went in and I had a hard conversation with Omid, and I was frustrated and talking about it. And between that Friday where I had the conversation and the Monday where I sort of was like, what's going to happen? What's going to happen? One of the things I realized, and it was sort of a seminal moment for me, which is like, I can have this hard conversation, and this one is not in my hands, right? So there's hard conversations where things are in your hands, and that produces its own kind of nervousness. There's hard conversations where it's actually really not in your hands, right? What you can do is put an issue on the table and go so far, and then it leaves you. And that has its own disturbance. And I kind of over the weekend, I don't know how it came to me, but it just did. I was just like, I just cannot control the outcome here. And I've got to be good with having put it on the table and said my piece, you know, and made my arguments, and let it go. And it's going to resolve how it's going to resolve. And so I was so tempted on that weekend, following my hard conversation, to send 2 emails and go keep banging. And I just didn't. It's like, I'm going to resist the temptation to just keep pounding on this issue, having put it on the table. And I put it on the table, and I left it for the weekend. And Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and ultimately it resolved, and it resolved in my favor. But it could just as well have not have. But for the sake of that relationship, I was like, I can keep pounding. I'm not going to change the probabilities of an outcome here, and the outcome is not entirely within my control. So that lesson about hard conversations and just recognizing it's not in your control and when to dial yourself back and like literally let it go was probably one of the seminal moments in my career. Again, for somebody who like thinks they can, you know, just get to any outcome and control and drive, you cannot always drive straight through a hard conversation to the outcome you want.
Margot, slight pivot for you, and then I'll bring it back to Sukhinder just in the interest of time. If you could give one tip to the audience about hard conversations that could dramatically change their framing, the outcome, their comfort level, what would it be?
You know, I would say the most important conversations to really think about are advocating for yourself based on what's important to you and not being afraid of that. And I think that, you know, if I look back on the early part of my career, you know, my husband also has a really successful career. We have 3 children, and we got married really young, and we had our kids young. So I always was working with kids in tow. And so I had to constantly think about, you know, I want to be really successful at work, but I also want to be a great parent, and I want to have a life that's in some reasonable balance. And I think I learned early on that if you really understand what's important to you, and you set those boundaries, and you do it in a really constructive way, and you're willing to sometimes do things that are a little uncomfortable because you maybe don't want to travel as much as that job opportunity you get off that looks so awesome. But then you actually find where there's a door, there's a window. As long as you're willing to pursue something else instead that might actually be really helpful to the company and is in tune with what you want to do personally as well. And so I found that was super helpful, and the earlier you start realizing it's okay to do that, and you start realizing that you find a way to make that awesome too, and it opens up a whole new set of opportunities, then all throughout my career, I was always keeping that check and balance. And I think that if you wait too long to do that, you start to build up this sense of, well, I've never done this yet, so I'm not going to start doing it. And so if you're feeling overwhelmed, start early, because all of a sudden you realize you're not taking that much risk. You're just being human, you know. And when you feel centered and you're excited at home and at work, you're just going to be a ton more effective at everything you do. And it could feel scary the first time, but I can tell you, having done it many times, I can tell you lots of stories. It works almost every time.
Sukhinder?
I think the piece of advice I'd give would be about demystifying hard conversations. So I think you demystify them fundamentally in 2 ways. Number one, again, when you're afraid to bring something up, the first thing to do is invite the other person. Just ask an open-ended question, and the hard conversation will come up all on its own. So one way is to, you know, you're always thinking about what you have to bring up. Part of it is just opening up that space and asking the other person how it's going. So I think inviting the hard conversation by giving people, just asking the open-ended question is one way to demystify it. The other way is just straight up practice, which is, You know, the more you have little hard conversations, the more they themselves become demystified, and you realize a hard conversation is just another conversation. And so sometimes it's like anything. It's with practice you get better at hard conversations, and that's because you just demystify them.
It seems to me that no matter how old we are and how much experience we have, this is always an area for improvement. 2 words that come to mind just in closing from hearing you guys talk is intention and attention. It seems like kind of those are 2 themes that you both have. If you're intentional about the conversation you want to have, the tone, the amount of preparation you do, what you think the outcome could be, how you bring that alignment together, and then attention. It seems like you're paying attention before, during, and afterwards. And so I would leave the audience with those 2 words for your next hard conversation. Be intentional and pay attention. Please thank me for an amazing panel with 2 amazing women. Thank you, Sukhinder and Margot.